The clock on the ER wall glowed past 2 a.m., its blue digits cutting through the dim, sleepless haze of Chicago's South Side. Outside, the streets near Chicago General Hospital were strangely still, just a thin drizzle glistening under the street lamps, a taxi swishing by, and the lonely echo of sirens in the distance. Inside Chicago General Hospital, the night shift was grinding forward, carrying that peculiar tension only emergency rooms know. Too quiet to trust, too heavy to relax. Nurses whispered to one another as they checked 4 bags. A janitor's mop squeaked across the tiles. Somewhere, a heart monitor kept time with a patient's fragile pulse. And standing in the middle of it all was Dr. Sarah Chun, a woman who by all appearances was in control. Her lab coat was crisp, her posture alert, her eyes sharp. But those who worked beside her knew the truth. Sarah carried a grief heavier than any shift. Her little girl, Emma, had died in an accident 3 years earlier. And since then, Sarah had lost more than just family. She had lost her faith. For her, the chapel in the hospital was just another hallway she never entered. The Bible, another book collecting dust. The name Jesus Christ, another story people clung to when medicine failed. Science was her fortress, the only ground she trusted. But that night, the night you're about to hear about, something entered that fortress, cracked its walls, and left Sarah with a question that no textbook could answer. The double doors of the ER slammed open. 2 EMTs rushed in, rain dripping from their jackets, a gurney rolling fast between them. On it lay a man in his 30s, clothes torn, feet bare, face streaked with dirt and blood. He looked like someone pulled straight off the streets of downtown Chicago. Yet there was something different. No ID, no wallet, nothing. One paramedic barked. Found him collapsed near Lakeshore Drive. He gave us a name before he blacked out. Sarah slipped on gloves, moving on instinct. Vitals low but steady. The patient was placed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sarah leaned in to inspect the wound at the man's side. It was messy, but shallow, not the kind of injury that should have brought someone down. She was about to order a scan when it happened. The man's eyes opened. They locked on Sarah's with a steadiness that froze her mid-sentence. There was no fear in them, no confusion, only depth like an ocean she couldn't see the bottom of. "Can you talk?" Sarah asked. The man's lips trembled. His voice came out hoarse, almost broken, but clear enough to strike. "I came for you, Sarah." Sarah jolted back. Her badge was hidden in her pocket, and no one had spoken her name. "Do we know each other?" she demanded, trying to steady her tone. The stranger didn't answer with facts. He only smiled faintly, as if he already knew Sarah's next thought. His eyes closed again, but the weight of his words lingered. One of the nurses muttered under her breath, "He's delirious." But Sarah wasn't so sure. The words rattled in her chest. "I came for you." For a heartbeat, the ER felt suspended in silence. Machines humming, nurses moving, but all fading behind that one voice. Sarah had seen 1,000 patients, but never one who shook her like this. And here's the hook that kept every doctor, every nurse, and now every viewer on edge. This man claimed no last name, carried no records, but spoke as if he knew the deepest wounds of the soul. He said his name was Jesus Christ. The man lay on the bed pale, but strangely composed, as if the chaos of the ER didn't touch him. His chest rose with uneven breaths, and blood still seeped from the shallow wound at his side. Nurses bustled around, prepping 4 lines, checking vitals, murmuring about his lack of identification. One muttered, another John Doe, scribbling notes on the chart. But Dr. Sarah Chun couldn't shake the moment when their eyes met. That calm, unblinking gaze wasn't normal. She had seen panic, delirium, shock, even resignation, but never that. It wasn't a patient begging for help. It was the look of someone who already knew exactly why he was there. Sarah stepped closer, stethoscope ready. "We'll get you stabilized. Just stay with me," she said in the steady tone that comforted hundreds of patients before. Yet her own voice felt hollow. The man's lips parted again, and with effort, he whispered, "I came for you, Sarah." The words sliced through the sterile air like a scalpel. Sarah froze, her mind racing. No one had spoken her name aloud. Her ID badge was buried in her coat pocket. There was no way the stranger could know. A nurse raised an eyebrow. Did he just call you by name? Sarah straightened, forcing a mask of control. Probably misheard. Patients in shock say all kinds of things. She turned toward the vitals monitor, pretending to study the numbers, but her heart was pounding harder than the beeps on the screen. Behind her, one paramedic whispered to the other, "That's creepy. Guy's out cold, but he sounds like he knows her." The stranger stirred again, his eyes opened, dark and steady, focusing only on Sarah. There was no fear there, no confusion, just recognition. Sarah swallowed. She leaned in, speaking low. "Listen, how do you know my name? Who told you?" The man didn't flinch. His expression softened, almost like pity. "You've been carrying it too long." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. Carrying what? But before an answer could come, the patient's strength seemed to fade. His eyelids lowered, his breathing steadied into shallow rhythms, and he drifted back toward unconsciousness. For a moment, the entire arse seemed to pause. Machines kept beeping, papers shuffled, shoes squeaked across the floor, but everyone nearby had felt it. Something about that exchange wasn't ordinary. The nurse closest to the bed shook her head. "He's delirious, that's all. Probably a drifter with a head injury." But Sarah knew better. She had seen delirium, heard the ramblings of fever and shock. This was different. Every syllable had landed with intention, as if meant only for her. She stepped back, gloves still on, her mind spinning. The phrases replayed like echoes bouncing down a long, empty corridor. One of the EMTs cleared his throat. "Doc, we're done here. You got him." Sarah nodded, though her thoughts were far from steady. "Yes, observation unit. I'll do the evaluation myself." As the stretcher rolled toward the curtained bay, the hospital door swung shut behind the paramedics, leaving the man, this so-called Jesus Christ, inside. Sarah followed, her jaw-tight clipboard in hand. The hall lights buzzed overhead as she walked, each step heavy with a mix of duty and unease. To her staff, it looked like any routine case. But inside, Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her, because for the first time in years, someone had spoken to her in a way no chart, no colleague, no therapist ever had. Not about symptoms, not about facts, but about the wound she kept buried. And the strangest part, this stranger, bleeding and nameless, didn't look like someone who needed saving. He looked like someone who had come to save her. The curtain in the observation bay swayed gently as the patient settled into uneasy sleep. Nurses adjusted monitors, their chatter low, their movements efficient. On the surface, it was just another case. A nameless man brought in from the streets, stitched, stabilized, and filed away. But for Dr. Sarah Chun, it was different. She lingered at the edge of the bed longer than she should have, her eyes fixed on the stranger's calm, almost peaceful expression. The words echoed in her mind. "I came for you, Sarah." Sarah knew. She had always known. She walked out of the bay, pushing the curtain aside with a sharp flick, as though she could leave the weight of those words behind. But the hospital hallways weren't neutral anymore. Every hum of a fluorescent bulb, every squeak of rubber soles on tile, every beep from a monitor seemed to drum up the memory she had worked so hard to bury. In the quietest corner of the staff lounge, Sarah poured herself a cup of stale black coffee and sat in the shadows. Her hands trembled slightly, though she masked it with a slow sip. No one noticed. That was how she liked it. For 3 years, no one had noticed the fracture that defined her. But tonight, a stranger had. Images she had forced out for years surged back uninvited. A summer evening, the smell of cut grass, the sound of a girl's laughter echoing in Lincoln Park. Emma, 8 years old, reckless curls falling into her eyes, clutching a red soccer ball as though it was treasure. Her daughter's laughter had once filled every empty corner of Sarah's life. And then, in a single night, it had been silence. The accident replayed in fragments sharper than any scalpel. The shriek of brakes, a shattered windshield, the blinding chaos of paramedics crowding the scene. And Emma, her girl, lying still, too still. Sarah had rushed to the hospital that night, not as a doctor, but as a mother begging for a miracle. But no miracle came, only a death certificate, only silence. Her marriage to David couldn't survive the storm. They tried for a year, clinging to each other with trembling hands, but grief doesn't always bind. It tears. He packed his things one morning while she was on shift, leaving behind nothing but a note. I can't live with the ghost of who you were. From that day forward, Sarah buried herself in work. Double shifts, holiday rotations, anything to drown the memory. To silence the guilt that whispered, you should have been there. You could have stopped it. Faith was the first casualty. God had been silent when Sarah screamed. Churches became buildings she drove past without a glance. The words Jesus, Christ became nothing more than an empty phrase muttered in anger under her breath. Until tonight, until a patient with no ID, no past, looked her in the eye and spoke as if he had read every hidden chapter of her life. The lounge door creaked open, breaking her spiral. A young resident stepped in, yawning. Rough night. Document Sarah straightened her face, a mask again. Same as always. But inside, nothing was the same. When the resident left, Sarah remained, gripping the styrofoam cup until it cracked in her hand. She tossed it into the trash and pressed her palms against the table, head bowed. She had spent years keeping her grief locked away, walled behind reason and science. Yet, a man she didn't know, lying wounded in her ER, had managed to crack it open with a single sentence. Back in the observation bay, the monitors continued their steady rhythm. The patient, Jesus Christ, that's what he called himself, lay there as if time didn't matter. Nurses passed in and out, noting vitals, adjusting IVs, whispering about how strange it was that he never flinched, never asked for anything. But to Sarah, the strangest thing wasn't in the patient's composure. It was in how this man's presence had resurrected the one thing she had sworn to bury. Hope. And hope was dangerous. Hope meant remembering Emma's smile, her laughter, her red soccer ball. Hope meant admitting that somewhere deep inside, Sarah still longed for more than the sterile certainty of medicine. She clenched her fists, whispering under her breath as if arguing with the air. It wasn't supposed to be this way. I wasn't supposed to lose her. I wasn't supposed to. But the sentence hung unfinished, drowned out by the steady beep of a heart monitor in the next room. A monitor that belonged to the man who had just cracked the shell of her soul. For the first time in years, Dr. Sarachin wasn't sure if she was the one treating a patient or if the patient had come to treat her. The morning crept into Chicago like a reluctant guest, tinting the hospital windows with pale gray light. Inside the observation unit, the man who called himself Jesus Christ lay quietly, his vitals stable, his expression unervingly serene. Nurses rotated in and out, charting numbers, adjusting lines, checking dressings. To most of them, he was just another patient. To Sarah Chun, he was a riddle that refused to be solved. Sarah entered with her clipboard tucked under one arm, determination written across her face. She wasn't here for miracles. She was here for answers. She pulled up a chair beside the bed and spoke in her clinical tone. Your wound's shallow. No internal bleeding. You'll recover fine, but I need your full name, contact information, anything. The man turned his head slowly, his eyes locking on his Sarah with the same piercing calm from the night before. You already know my name, he said softly. Sarah tightened her grip on the clipboard. Jesus Christ. Her voice carried more skepticism than respect. That's what you told the paramedics. Is that what you want me to write on your chart? Jesus didn't flinch. My chart isn't the one that matters, Sarah. Yours is. The words slid past every defense Sarah tried to hold. She shifted in her chair, crossing her arms. Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but this is a hospital. We deal in evidence, in data, not riddles. For a long moment, Jesus said nothing. Then, in a voice steady and low, he spoke 3 words that shattered the air. It wasn't yours. Sarah blinked. The weight you carry, the blame, the endless nights replaying what you could have done. It wasn't yours to bear. The clipboard slipped slightly from Sarah's hand, her jaw tightened, and she stood abruptly. You don't know what you're talking about. At the nurse's station, Maria, a veteran nurse, watched through the curtain gap. She'd seen Sarah lose her composure before. Angry family members, combative patients, crushing losses. But this was different. Her shoulders weren't squared in defense. They sagged under invisible weight. Later that afternoon, Maria herself experienced something uncanny. While checking Jesus for her, he looked at her and said, "Your father forgave you long before you forgave yourself." Her hands froze mid-adjustment. No one in this hospital knew about the guilt she carried. Walking out on her father during his last weeks, too afraid to watch him fade. Tears stung her eyes before she quickly wiped them away, whispering, "How could you possibly know that?" Jesus only gave her a look that wasn't pity, but release. Down the hall, an elderly woman in palliative care, Mrs. Rodriguez, received a visit from Jesus when Sarah briefly allowed him to stretch his legs. He sat beside her, his voice gentle. "You'll see him soon. Don't be afraid." Minutes later, she passed away, smiling without sedation, her family stunned by her peace. The whispers spread like wildfire through the ward. The patient in Bay 3, he knows things. He said something to Angela about her daughter who went missing. He comforted Mrs. Rodriguez without meds. How does he do it? Sarah heard every rumor, every hushed conversation. She stormed back into the room, frustration boiling. "Stop this," she snapped. "You're filling people's heads with whatever this is, false hope. Do you know how dangerous that can be?" Jesus turned his gaze back to her, unwavering. "Hope isn't dangerous, Sarah. Despair is." Sarah's breath caught. Her anger tangled with something deeper. "Why me?" she demanded. "Why say those things to me? Why drag up what I've spent years burying?" Jesus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to, because burying isn't healing. And you, Sarah, you've been treating broken bodies while ignoring your own broken soul. The silence that followed was heavier than any diagnosis, heavier than any death pronouncement Sarah had ever made. She wanted to argue, to dismiss it all as delusion, but somewhere inside she recognized the truth, and it terrified her. From the hallway, Maria watched Sarah's face, her usually unshakable doctor, struggle between fury and collapse. She whispered to another nurse, "She looks less like a physician right now and more like a patient." And perhaps for the first time in years, that's exactly what she was. By midweek, the hospital buzzed with something different. An energy that had nothing to do with rushing stretchers or ringing pagers. It was quieter, more elusive, like a ripple moving beneath the surface of the ordinary. And at the center of it was the nameless man in Bay 3 who called himself Jesus Christ. Word traveled fast in hospitals. Housekeepers whispered to transport staff. Residents traded stories in the break room. Nurses leaned closer in the medication line, lowering their voices. "He told me something only my mother knew. He prayed with a patient, and she passed away smiling. I don't know what it is, but being near him, it feels different. For some, it was curiosity. For others, unease. But for nearly everyone, it was undeniable. Take Angela, the night shift transporter. For 10 years, she had carried patients from ward to ward, silent and unseen, her own grief sealed away. Her daughter had vanished as a teenager, and though the police files went cold, the wound never did. She had learned to bury it under routine. Bed sheets, wheelchairs, elevator rides. But when she passed Bay 3, the patient had simply looked at her and said, "She's alive, Angela, in Milwaukee, working at a cafe." She never hated you. She was just scared. Angela collapsed into a chair, weeping. She hadn't spoken her daughter's name aloud in years. Nobody could have known. And yet, this man had spoken it into the open air like it had always been there, waiting. Then there was Carlos, the young medical intern. He was 4 months into his residency, still carrying textbooks in his backpack like talismans. Behind his polite smile hid a storm, his mother's cancer diagnosis and the bitterness he held toward the father who had abandoned them years earlier. When he entered the bay to check vitals, the patient greeted him before he could speak. "You don't have to forgive him for his sake, Carlos. Forgiveness is the gift that frees you." The words hit like lightning. Carlos froze, stethoscope hanging useless around his neck. He hadn't told anyone, not his colleagues, not even his mother. Yet somehow, the wound he thought invisible had been named in a single breath. Even Maria, the veteran nurse, who had seen everything from gunshot victims to holiday miracles, wasn't immune. She had long since hardened herself against patient stories. Too many, too heavy. But one afternoon, as she adjusted the four, Jesus whispered, "Your father never left you." His love was greater than the words he never said. Tears burned in her eyes. It had been 20 years since her father's funeral, yet the absence still shadowed her. She wiped her face quickly, embarrassed, but the seed had been planted. The ripples spread outward in unpredictable ways. A terminal patient in palliative care passed peacefully after Jesus told her she would soon see her husband again. A janitor confessed to feeling lighter after the patient told him, "You are not invisible here." Even the skeptical attending physician, Dr. Williams, caught himself lingering in the hall, listening for fragments of whatever conversation was unfolding inside Bay 3. Of course, not everyone welcomed it. A few staff members scoffed, muttering about psychosis, manipulation, or coincidence. "He's just guessing," one orderly said. People see what they want to see, but even they couldn't ignore the atmosphere. Something was happening. And Sarah, she felt it most of all. Every time she walked past the curtain, she heard whispers, not only from colleagues, but from her own conscience. Words she'd buried for years rose up, echoing against the simple phrases Jesus spoke. "It wasn't your fault." One night, standing at the nurse's station, Sarah overheard two aides talking. "I swear it's like he looks into you," one said. "Like he knows the worst thing about you and loves you anyway." Sarah clenched her jaw and turned away. Love was a language she hadn't spoken in years. But as much as she tried to dismiss it, the ripple had reached her, too. The hospital carried on, of course, alarms blaring, stretchers rolling, phones ringing. But something had shifted in the undercurrent. People lingered longer at bedsides. They listened a little more. They smiled even in exhaustion. All because of a man with no records, no history, no explanation. A man who called himself Jesus Christ. And whether they wanted to believe it or not, every person who crossed his path walked away changed. By the fourth night, Dr. Sarah Chun could barely look at the chart without her pulse quickening. The patient labs were clean. Imaging revealed nothing abnormal. His vitals remained steady. By every measurable standard, the man in Bay 3 should have been just another John Doe waiting for social services to intervene. But nothing about him was ordinary. Sarah entered the room, determined to cut through the haze. She carried the weight of whispers, nurses in tears, patients comforted, staff members unsettled. This wasn't medicine. This was intrusion into the one place Sarah still trusted. Science. The man sat upright, gazing through the window at the Chicago skyline. His voice was calm, almost conversational. "Long night, Sarah." Sarah bristled. "I didn't come here for riddles. I came to get answers." She opened the chart with a snap. "How do you know these things about people? How did you know about my daughter? About Angela's daughter? About Maria's father?" Jesus didn't look away from the glass. "I don't guess." Sarah's laugh was short and bitter. "See, people don't just see trauma buried for years. They don't predict patients' deaths with uncanny timing. They don't." She stopped herself, her throat tightening. Finally, the man turned to face her. "Science has trained you to measure the body, but who measures the soul?" Sarah slammed the chart shut. The soul doesn't show up on scans. It doesn't keep someone alive in cardiac arrest. It doesn't stop a drunk driver from killing your 80-year-old girl on a summer night. The words hung in the air, harsher than she intended, laced with venom she had carried too long. She blinked rapidly, trying to shove back the image of Emma's red soccer ball rolling into the street. He leaned forward, voice steady, almost tender. "You're not angry at science, Sarah. You're angry at God, because you can't understand why he let it happen." Sarah's chest rose and fell with sharp breaths. She had told no one that. Not her ex-husband David, not her colleagues, not even herself in clear terms. To hear it spoken aloud was unbearable. She gripped the edge of the bedrail. "I don't believe in God. It doesn't change that he believes in you." The sentence cut deeper than any scalpel. Sarah turned away, pacing, her coat sweeping behind her, her thoughts colliding. Years of medical training, thousands of cases, a life of reason. All of it reduced to rubble by words too simple to dismiss. From a hallway, intern Carlos paused, overhearing fragments. He saw Sarah's shoulders tense, saw her drag a hand across her face like a woman wrestling with invisible chains. To Carlos, who had been secretly praying for his mother's cancer battle, it was a confirmation of what he already felt. This patient wasn't here by random chance. Inside, Sarah planted herself back in the chair, anger rising to shield her breaking heart. Do you know what medicine does? It saves lives. It's blood transfusions, antibiotics, scalpels in the right hands. Not faith, not hope, and certainly not God. Jesus nodded slowly. Science is a language of the body. Faith is a language of the spirit. Both are true, but you've been speaking only half the truth. Sarah clenched her fists. And what did faith ever give me? My daughter is still dead. The man's reply was quiet, but unrelenting. Your daughter is not gone from love, and neither are you. Sarah stood abruptly, knocking the chair back. Her face was flushed, her jaw set. She stormed out of the room, past nurses exchanging uneasy glances. Maria reached out, as if to stop her, but she brushed past, disappearing into the dim corridor. In the lounge, she leaned over the sink, splashing water on her face. Her reflection stared back, tired, hollow, cracked open by words she couldn't escape. Not angry at science, angry at God. For the first time in years, Sarah Chun, the woman who trusted only what could be measured, found herself trembling at the possibility that there was more. And that possibility terrified her more than death itself. The chapel at Chicago General was a place most staff forgot existed. Tucked into a quiet corner of the hospital's oldest wing, it sat behind double wooden doors, its pews worn smooth by decades of restless hands, its stained glass windows filtering the chaos of the South Side into muted fragments of color. For years, Dr. Sarah Chun had walked past those doors without a glance. Prayer was for others, for people who didn't know better, for people who hadn't lost everything. But that night, long after the confrontation in Bay 3, her feet carried her there without asking permission from her mind. The hallway was silent except for the hum of vending machines and the faint squeak of her shoes. Her hand hovered at the door, trembling. She almost turned away, but something pressed her forward and the latch clicked open. Inside, the air was cooler, tinged with wax and incense long burned out. Rows of empty pews stretched toward a small altar. A flickering candle stood sentinel near a brass cross, its flame bending in the draft like it too was uncertain. Sarah stepped inside, closing the door behind her. The sound of the latch echoed in the hollow space, sealing her into a room she had avoided since the night Emma died. She sat down halfway up the aisle, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't know how to pray anymore. Words felt useless. All she had left were questions too raw to voice. And then from the corner of the chapel, a voice spoke. You don't need words, Sarah. Sometimes being here is enough. She looked up sharply. 2 pews ahead, the patient sat quietly, hands folded, gaze fixed on the cross. No guards, no monitors, no 4 poles. Just him, sitting as if he had always belonged in this room. Sarah's pulse surged. How did you get out of the ward? She demanded, her instinct as a doctor firing. You're supposed to be under observation. Jesus turned, and the calm in his eyes silenced every protest. Observation doesn't require walls, he said. Sarah sank back against the pew, a mix of fear and something she refused to name. Why here? Why follow me? I didn't follow you, Jesus replied softly. You came because your heart was louder than your doubt. Sarah's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to insist that she had stumbled here by accident. But deep down she knew better. Her voice broke as she whispered. I never came here, not even when Emma died. Not when my marriage ended. Not when I screamed for answers in the dark. Why would I start now? Jesus looked at her, not with judgment, but with a steady compassion that felt unbearable. Because you're ready. You thought God abandoned you, But he was there in the silence, in the broken pieces, waiting. And he's here now. The words hit Sarah like a wave. She pressed her palms together, shaking her head. I don't know how to believe anymore. I'm afraid. Jesus leaned forward slightly, his voice firm yet gentle. It's all right to fear. Just don't let fear be your guide. The silence stretched, heavy yet not crushing. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to feel the weight of her grief, not as punishment, but as proof that she had loved deeply. Tears blurred her vision, slipping down her face uninvited. Through the stained glass windows, dawn light began to filter in, casting colors across the pews. The red and gold hues landed on Sarah's shoulders like a mantle. She whispered, barely audible, "If forgiving means pretending it's okay, then I can't." Jesus shook his head slowly. Forgiveness isn't saying it was okay. It's laying down the stone you've been carrying, even if the one who gave it to you never asks. Forgiveness is freedom, not surrender. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the words sink past every defense she had built. For once, the silence inside her didn't scream. It rested. When she opened her eyes again, Jesus was rising to his feet. He walked past Sarah, the faint scent of rain and earth trailing behind him, and paused at the door. His voice was low, but it filled every corner of the chapel. Every day is a chance to choose again, Sarah. You don't need to be perfect to be loved. You only need to stop hiding.